Welcome back. You're watching DD India News Hour. A quick recap of the headlines.
A successful and action-packed G20 summit wraps up in New Delhi with India's Narendra Modi handing over the ceremonial gavel to Brazil.
The Indian Prime Minister holds bilateral meetings with the French President Emmanuel Macron. The leaders assess and review progress in bilateral relations.
And Prime Minister Modi holds a series of other bilateral meetings with leaders of Germany, the European Union, South Korea, among others.
Now, after the conclusion of the G20 summit in New Delhi, Prime Minister Modi visited the International Media Centre.
Well, the Prime Minister greeted people who had gathered there. All the media contingents. The media centre is adjacent to the Bharat Mandapam, where the summit was held.
The media centre had world-class facilities, and this showcased the power of New India.
Prime Minister Modi acknowledging the contribution that the media contingents from the world over, about 3,000 of them, have made to the success of the G20 summit in New Delhi. And the Indian Prime Minister also visited the vibrant Crafts Mela, which was organized as part of the G20 summit.
The Craft Mela showcased the rich cultural diversity of Indian states. It showcased a wide range of traditional tribal art, artifacts, paintings, pottery, textiles, organic, natural products as well.
Prime Minister visited a number of stalls featuring a wide array of items from several states. He even interacted with the artists who were giving live demos of their craft, as you see in these images.
Right, so there you can see Prime Minister Modi interacting with the artisans who were present at the Crafts Bazaar put up at the venue of the G20 summit, the Bharat Mandapam, in the heart of the Indian capital, New Delhi.
This has been around for all the days that the summit was on, and it also became a place which was frequented by many delegates and the media contingent as well, because that's where they could buy a lot of artifacts as well. Even digital payments were facilitated and were done very smoothly.
Indeed, a perfect blend, Gautam, of the traditional and the modern, technology on the one hand and handicrafts on the other. And Prime Minister Modi also met workers at the Bharat Mandapam who worked there for the successful organization of the summit.
He even visited the Digital India Experience Zone, which is another major showcase for India's G20 summit, where it was clearly put across how there is a lot of technology, open source, that has been a success. It's proven technology in India, be it things like UPI or Aadhaar and many others, DigiLocker as well, that the world could simply adapt. India has been offering it to the world to take on and take over.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu maintained that if G20 leaders' declaration becomes a reality, then Israel will be a central junction in global economy and a bridge of peace.
The G20 Pact was announced on Saturday, aims to link West Asian or Middle Eastern countries by railways and connect them to India by port, which will help the flow of energy and trade from the Gulf to Europe and also of digital data.
Becoming a central junction in global economy and a bridge of peace that transforms us. We have already made Israel a central junction in the field of cyber, water and gas, and we will now do it also with transportation, energy and global communications. I think it is a very great blessing.
Speaking to media on the margins of the G20 summit in New Delhi, Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni hinted that Italy is planning to exit the Belt and Road Initiative, also known as the Silk Road, while asserting that the move will not compromise relations with China.
We also talked about the Belt Road, but not only the Belt Road. We have a strategic partnership with China, and so there is issue of the Belt Road initiative. But it is not the only element that builds our bilateral relationships with China. This is demonstrated by the fact that there are European nations which in recent years haven't been part of the Belt and Road, but have been able to forge more favorable relationships than we have sometimes managed. The issue is how to guarantee a partnership that is beneficial for both sides, leaving aside the decision that we will take on the BRI.
Well, this was in the context of Giorgia Meloni having a bilateral with the Chinese representative, Premier Li Xiang, here in Delhi on the sidelines of the G20 summit. And Italy is the only G7 member that's part of the BRI, the Chinese BRI. Now, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has termed the G20 summit a success and said that due to the consolidated position of the countries of the global south, Russia managed to ensure the G20 agenda was not overshadowed by the Ukraine conflict. Lavrov also said that Russia is willing to return to the Black Sea grain deal as soon as its conditions are met.
Earlier on Saturday, India and the United States co-chaired the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment to announce an India-West Asia-Europe economic corridor.
It will be a medium for economic integration with West Asia and Europe. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi said that through this initiative, the global South nations will get a boost in several sectors.
हमने ग्लोबल साउथ के अनेक देशों में एक विश्वसनीय पार्टनर के रूप में एनर्जी, रेलवे, वाटर, टेक्नोलॉजी पार्क्स जैसे क्षेत्रों में इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर प्रोजेक्ट्स इंप्लीमेंट किए। इन प्रयासों में हमने डिमांड ड्रिवन और ट्रांसपेरेंट अप्रोच पर विशेष रूप से बल दिया है। पीजीआईआई के माध्यम से हम ग्लोबल साउथ के देशों में इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर गैप को कम करने में महत्वपूर्ण योगदान दे सकते हैं।
Prime Minister Modi also said that connectivity is one of the most important pillars, adding that financial viability should be the focus rather than debt burden.
कनेक्टिविटी इनिशिएटिव्स को प्रमोट करते हुए कुछ मूलभूत सिद्धांतों का सुनिश्चित किया जाना महत्वपूर्ण है। डेट बर्डन की जगह फाइनेंशियल वायबिलिटी को बढ़ावा देना और पर्यावरण के सभी मापदंडों का पालन करना। आज जब हम कनेक्टिविटी का इतना बड़ा इनिशिएटिव ले रहे हैं, तब हम आने वाली पीढ़ियों के सपनों के विस्तार के बीज बो रहे हैं।
And on another account, speaking to the media in New Delhi, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan described India as the greatest trade partner in South Asia.
Within the context of my visit, I've had the privilege to get together with the Prime Minister of India, Mr. Modi, on a bilateral basis. India is our greatest trade partner in South Asia, and we have great potential to enjoy primarily in the field of economy and many others. And I'm so happy to say that we will be able to enjoy a full opportunity to exercise this potential.
India's Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman on Saturday said that better, bigger and effective multilateral development banks will contribute to enhancing representation of voice of developing nations in decision-making.
Let me share with you just some of the key achievements of the Indian presidency, the finance track. First one is the outcomes which are focused on strengthening the MDBs to address shared global challenges of the 21st century. So under this strengthening MDBs, there are 4 key highlights that I'd like to bring to your notice. The first one is agreement on the need for a better, bigger and more effective MDBs. It is so necessary to have better, bigger and more effective MDBs because the developmental demands from all across the globe is so high, these institutions will have to be better and bigger. This is also going to contribute to enhancing representation and voice of developing countries in the decision making.
So what we've been trying to do for you through the course of this special broadcast, which started at 8 p.m. Indian Standard Time, is an overview of what happened through the course of the 2 days that the G20 summit was on, through the summit itself and on the sidelines as well. Let's bring in our guest as well, who's now joining us, Professor Harshvardhan Pant, Vice President of the Observer Research Foundation. Good evening to you as well, Professor Pant. In terms of how these 2 days have gone by, there are a lot of things that stand out, but in terms of putting India across as a nation that has led the world in a certain direction which promotes its own worldview, how do you see these developments?
For a long time, India, there were question marks by the external stakeholders about the willingness and the ability of India to lead. And I think with this summit, India has shown that it can not only do mega diplomacy at this scale very effectively, but it can also lead and shape the global governance agenda. And I think that in some ways is the highlight of the summit, that now India is firmly embedded in the global governance structures of this international order. And as we are looking at a very transformative moment in this world order, India's voice, which it is trying to sync with the larger voice from the global south, becomes the primary medium through which the aspirations, the hopes, and the interests of a large part of the developing world are projected onto the global stage becomes very evident. And I thought in some ways the last 2 days were a reflection of that reality as to how the world is changing, how the world order is evolving, how we find ourselves today in the midst of a big flux where new stakeholders are joining this conversation. The sheer fact that the entire agenda of the G20 was framed around the global south, and that African Union entered the G20, making it G21, and effectively changing the very character of G20. It is no longer simply the most prosperous nations on the world. It is also today reflective of the wider aspirations of the developing world. So in that sense, I think India has led this process through the last few months, which culminated in the Delhi Declaration. And India has led it very effectively in shaping what perhaps are going to be the key determinants of the global governance architecture going forward. So I thought in that context, the big picture is pretty clear, pretty obvious. And one hopes that as the despondency about the existing multilateral institutions continues to be with us for a while, perhaps the optimism of this G20 can percolate down to those institutions and perhaps make them more dynamic and more representative of the kind of world that we live in today.
Indeed. Ambassador Kumar, I want you to dwell a bit more, if you will, on something that you said in your earlier intervention. You described the India, West Asia, Europe economic corridor as an alternative to China's Belt and Road Initiative. In that context, I'd like you to give our viewers some context here in terms of what we heard from the Italian Prime Minister here in New Delhi on the margins of the G20 summit. Italy, hinting in so many words that Rome will pull out of the Chinese BRI. The deadline is December this year, and the indications are Italy will become the first and the only G7 country, in fact, to pull out of the Chinese BRI. What does that tell you about Italy and the G7 vis-a-vis China?
No, I think it's very obvious that Europe is disenchanted with China, to put it mildly. And all of this happened, I think, immediately after COVID. You will recall that China was initially praised in Italy, and then gradually there has been so much of disillusionment. And this has now reached its apogee, if you like, where I think people are saying we don't want to be part of it. I think what you are seeing in the world is really two kinds of values and visions, if you like, both for infrastructure, supply chains, critical minerals, just even trade. So some fragmentation of the world, despite the rhetoric, is inevitable. I think there is going to be fragmentation. And I think China is at the center of it, is at the heart of it. There is no getting away from it. I've talked to Chinese analysts who readily concede that the Belt and Road Initiative can be accused of strategic overextension. The initial vision of Belt and Road Initiative was to take it up to Latin America. And that is now fallen by the wayside. But I think, secondly, some of the negative examples that you see of BRI, whether it is Italy getting out or Kenya, Hambantota, Ghana, I think these have not been good advertisements for China. That's the second issue. The third issue, of course, is a perception problem, frankly. They have a huge perception problem now where there is a large degree of unpredictability in China in terms of business, in terms of doing trade. You just don't have security and predictability. So I think all these things have come together. With regard to Italy getting out of BRI, I think it was a lot of it was in the making, frankly. So it is not a great surprise anymore. But what is perhaps now happening is that you will find a set of countries, and I said, as I made my point earlier, what actually, if you look at the declaration, I would make 2 points. One, a number of the initiatives that India has pushed is actually to provide an alternative to China. So when we want, for example, reform of the multilateral development banks, you want World Bank and IMF to have greater ability to lend for poorer countries, both for sustainable development goals and climate change. That is largely in contrast to Chinese lending, frankly. So because so far, the World Bank has not been able to fulfill the demand of the lower income countries or the developing countries. So China has had a head start. So I think that is one thing that is being sought to be done. The second point, expanding on Professor Harsh Pant's point, is I would put it like this. I think so far India has been a rule taker. We have accepted rules which have been set by others because we have had no choice. And whether it is trade and whether it is supply chains, for example, the global value chains, we were not able to get onto it. I think for the first time, when I look at this declaration, I see an Indian attempt at shaping rules for tomorrow. So, for example, there is a Goa roadmap of tourism in the declaration. There is an encasing Lawrence Summers committee which has got a roadmap for the reform of the multilateral development banks. A Jaipur call for action when it comes to small and medium enterprises. A Deccan high principles, for example, in the area of food security and agriculture. There is a high life principles for life, which is, the Prime Minister's initiative of environment. And there is a voluntary principles of green hydrogen. So all of these areas, especially the cutting edge areas of climate change, hydrogen, food security, and even tourism, even small enterprises, I think we are trying to shape rules in these areas. Can we set norms and can we set rules in these areas? Because so far, Indian diplomacy has been largely a rule taker. Rules are formulated elsewhere. We may or may not participate in it. For example, I can speak with authority on the WTO, which is a rule-making organization. But if you ask me very frankly what India did in the Uruguay round, we merely resisted the formation of rules and eventually accepted it. We did not create our own rules, or we did not put forward proposals for new standards and new rules. But I think now the time has come when India, I see incipient attempts. To be honest, one should not exaggerate it. I don't think we have reached a stage where we are able to say, okay, we did the rules in these areas.
Yes.
But I see incipient attempts by India. And allow me to make just one last point again on rule shaping. Digital public infrastructure. If we can do the One Future Alliance in digital public infrastructure and somehow set rules in this area, and India is supremely capable of doing it, then I think we would have made the transition from rule takers to rule shapers. And I think that is the basic vision. At least I see the beginning of a journey in this G20 declaration where we are trying to set the rules in some niche areas.
Well, to a certain extent, this G20 has been disruptive as well, in the sense how African Union has found a place in a grouping of nations which are considered rich. Then there's, of course, this corridor that has been agreed to, and even the biofuels alliance as well. And if I could again bring in Ambassador Mukul on this, in terms of those forces that would have an interest in the status quo, do you feel that this is something that would worry, say, a country like China?
Well, I think these are very major achievements of the summit. The coming in of Africa, I think, has been agreed to by everyone, because it is part of the global south and there was a consensus. But what it addresses is a very acute Africa deficit, which has been in the G20 for the last 24 years. So in that sense, I think it is very important. With regard to the India, Middle East, Europe corridor, and as a person who has served 4 times in the Gulf and the Middle East, including in Saudi Arabia and UAE, I'm absolutely delighted that this has happened. But the fundamental point, I think, to understand here is that that India's relations with these countries has really changed. It has been a transformation of India's relations with Saudi Arabia, with UAE and other GCC countries and other Middle East countries, that we are now in a position to even propose a project, a mega project of that nature. Of course, this is just the beginning. As the UAE representative, we heard this afternoon say that there is a follow-up meeting to work out the project details, and then next year the funding. So obviously this is a great challenge going forward. But even to announce a project really took the relationship between these countries, and therein I think India's relations with Saudi Arabia, with UAE have really been transformed in the last 4 or 5 years, or in the last few years, if I can put it that way. And with regard to the global biofuels alliance that you referred to, I think that is something, again, very, very ambitious but futuristic. And I think, again, India has been able to put that on the agenda of the G20, and I think it'll need to be looked at. But again, these are very major developments, and what will be the implications of these mega projects, the GBA or the India-Middle East corridor, remains to be seen. But by themselves, the announcements have been major. The Africa thing, there is another interesting aspect to the AU getting into the G20. I've already heard some proposals or read some proposals that under the Brazilian presidency, they would try to bring in the group of Latin American and Caribbean countries would also seek. Now, in what way, whether that will happen, not happen, whether they'll come in as a permanent invitee or as a full member, remains to be seen. But I think the decision to get in African Union was seminal, in the sense that it was the first time in 24 years that the G20 addressed this issue in a meaningful manner, and there has been an expansion, and in the process, the Africa deficit, which we have been speaking about for years, has been resolved.
Right. Professor Pant, I want to draw your attention to a leader who was conspicuous by his absence, and I'm referring here particularly to President Xi Jinping of China. What do you make of his absence from the summit? And generally, how would China be looking at the success of this year's G20 summit in New Delhi? As they say, Professor Pant, if you're not at the table, you're probably on the menu. The Chinese leader, the premier, Li Qiang, has held a meeting with the UK Prime Minister on the margins of the summit here in Delhi. And the UK government has condemned or criticized Chinese actions when it comes to the UK-China relations. We've seen Italian Prime Minister hint that it will pull out of the Chinese BRI. How would Beijing be looking at the outcome from the G20 summit tonight as we speak?
See, Ramesh, I think Beijing, of course, would be looking at it a bit warily because India is almost proposing something which goes, which is countering Chinese approach to global politics in so many fundamental ways, and therefore from the very beginning, when we were hearing that Chinese were very obstructionist in the various tracks of G20, there was a sense that perhaps China is trying to scuttle the G20. And then when finally they agreed, I think it was very clear to the Chinese that look, the way India had framed the G20 agenda and the way the world, especially the G20 members, were rallying around India, including some very contending powers like the US on one side, European Union, and even Russia. Prime Minister talked to Vladimir Putin. Prime Minister Modi talked to Vladimir Putin directly just a few days before the G20 summit. And I think there was a sense that perhaps if China does not agree to the text, it might, as people have pointed out, be looked at as the spoiler. So certainly, I think there was pressure on China. Now, the reasons why the Chinese president was not here can be debated endlessly. Some people have talked about domestic issues. Some have talked about the US-China issue. Some have talked about India-China issue. But look, Ramesh, one thing which is very interesting in all what has happened in the last few days is that India comes out as a very confident, ambitious country that is forging partnerships far and wide and is crafting a foreign policy agenda that is not simply premised on its own interests, but is also dovetailed very well with the larger issues of the global south. So somewhere down the line, when you talk of connectivity, when you talk of digital partnerships, when you talk of inclusive growth, when you talk of inclusive globalization, I think a lot of these issues look very different from Beijing, because Beijing has articulated a very imperialist economic and political agenda sitting, as far as the Chinese Communist Party under Xi Jinping is concerned. So certainly they would be looking at some of these issues very, very, with a degree of concern, because as you were discussing earlier, whether the India, Middle East, Europe initiative is a counter to BRI or not, what is happening in the G7, what is happening now, the India outreach to the global south has become very substantive, what it means for China's own outreach to the global south. I think all those issues, there is no getting away from the fact that multiple contending contestations are shaping global politics. In the past, we used to say this is all about China and the US. But I think now we are also getting a sense that somewhere down the line, this is also becoming a China versus India. That India is also now pushing back against China in ways that are very interesting in the realm of ideas, for example. The whole connectivity debate, the way India has framed that debate in terms of very different set of ideas that China brought to the table with BRI. So I think not simply in material terms, where certainly India can't compete dollar for dollar with the Chinese, but what it can do is shape partnerships. It is ahead in terms of partnerships. It can shape the rules of the game. It can create new norms, as Ambassador Kumar was speaking. And I think that's what India intended to do with the G20 process. And in some ways, it seems to have succeeded as of now. So I think it's going to be an interesting engagement with China going forward. How do they react? What happens to the border issue? What happens to some of the more contentious developments? And what happens to multiple other platforms where India and China sit together trying to figure out global governance? And I think this relationship has become much more fascinating after G20.
Oh yes, definitely, and we will talk about the FOMO factor a bit more, because we have some interesting asides to mention over there. But for the moment, I'll just ask all three of you to bear with us for a moment, because what we've got is Chief Secretary of the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, Apurva Chandra, has spoken exclusively with DD India's Sakal Bhatt, and he said India's public broadcaster Doordarshan, which is us, stood up to its expectation in its broadcast of the G20 summit.
It's curtains down for the 18th edition of G20 under India's presidency, and with that, India has also handed over the presidency to Brazil. But talking about G20 under India's presidency or chair, it has been actually a highly unprecedented and historic in nature, with many big firsts associated with it, and most importantly, some tangible outcomes. We're very glad and honored, rather, to have with us Secretary Information and Broadcasting, Government of India, Shri Apurva Chandra ji, with us in our very DD India setup studio in Mandapam facility, which has garnered, in fact, global eyeballs. Let's get talking to him, sir. To begin with, how do you see the conclusion bit of it, but most particularly the fact that the Doordarshan, the state broadcaster, beamed these live exclusive visuals across the globe, which in a way has also been historic in nature.
Yes, the G20 presidentship of India itself has been historic, and I think in that the role of Doordarshan also is historic, because Doordarshan has come up to the expectations and has transmitted 4K for the first time, which is being happening in India. From HD it has migrated to 4K, and this feed has been taken throughout the world. All the major channels of the world, they have taken the clean feed from Doordarshan, and that is how it has been transmitted across the world. The people have seen the visuals, the people have seen the capability of Doordarshan, and DD India, which was revamped only recently for the purpose of G20, now it is shown that it has arrived, and it is going to stay, and it is going to become one of the primary focus channels to take to take the story of India to the world.
Yeah, India's voice to the world, that's the tagline of DD India. It's basically the international arm of the national news broadcaster. Before I talk about the tangible outcomes, a little bit more elaboration on the scale and expanse of the coverage, not only on DD India, but the entire Doordarshan network.
What we see here in this media center, that is a culmination of India's presidency. But the entire coverage of G20 began a year back when India assumed the presidency last December, at the end of November, when they assumed the presidency from Indonesia. And then, under the vision and guidance of our Honorable Prime Minister, more than 200 meetings were held in 60 cities with more than 100,000 delegates from all across the world. And taking that story forward, taking it across the world to the far corners of the world and far corners of our country, that has been achieved by Doordarshan. Today, there would be hardly any citizen in the country who doesn't know that G20 is happening in the country. And the achievements of India, what we have achieved through this declaration which happened yesterday, that also will now be taken forward by Doordarshan and DD India.
Doordarshan has been an integral part of the, like Honorable Secretary talked about, India's presidency. Across 60 cities, sir, as you mentioned, more than 200 meetings, dedicated programming and micro-level coverage of the entire event. Would you like to share some insights in that? Because that must have been an extremely humongous task, nationwide networking.
Yes, as the Prime Minister directed that the meetings have to be held all across the country, so more than 60 cities, 20 states, 8 union territories, and meetings are held everywhere. So Doordarshan, even though the setup may be there, may not be there, but they did go there, whether it is through OB van, through backpacks, but the transmission was done, and the story was carried for not only our country, but throughout the world. And Doordarshan has succeeded in that, and today everybody is praising the G20 summit and the G20, the entire one-year program which has been held in India, and for that, Doordarshan has a big role to play.
Yes. Secretary Chandra, talking about the state-of-the-art technology plus this media center, I have been interacting with a lot of foreign journalists also who have covered earlier G20 summits, not really comparing, but one thing, like a common denominator that has been coming up in our conversation since last 2 days is the way the media coverage and the whole arrangement of the broadcast.
Yes, this media center, a few days back before the start of this summit, I had said that we will set the gold standard. And today I think all the media people who are here, they are vouching for that this kind of media center has never been seen earlier in any of the G20s.
Yes.
And it is not just the technical parameters, because today, I mean here, just now I was checking, the 5G speed here was more than 1 Gbps. So that kind of speeds which are available, the uplinking and the uplinking facilities, the transmission rooms, the interview rooms, the media rooms, all that, the 1,300 or more workstations, so everything is there. But apart from that, the comfort of the media, I think that where we show our hospitality, not only to the delegates, but also the media, that is also on display.
It has been a very good feedback for the food, by the way, on a lighter note.
So this availability of snacks 24/7, availability of food, and apart from that, this the cultural exhibition which has been held, which is being held here, where the culture, where the handicrafts of all these states are on display and high quality products are available, and that too, that again is a part of the display that you can use UPI and e-rupee for buying those products, which again I think is a unique experience, would be a unique experience for the foreign media.
Yes. You know, sir, talk about culture and heritage that we do know that has been there as one of the cornerstones under India's G20 presidency. But also at the same time, since we are talking about media center, the showcasing of India's culture and heritage is writ large. And that is something which is also unique about the summitry aspect under India's presidency. The curating of this whole event.
The culture, of course, has been an inherent part, and culture includes the dances, the location itself, and also the food and the welcome. It encompasses everything.
Indian hospitality.
And the hospitality. So it encompasses everything, and it is, this summit, of course, is the culmination, but then those 60 cities, they were chosen that they had something to show about the culture of that particular part of India. And the engagement groups, normally they had 3 or 4 meetings. The working groups, they had 3 or 4 meetings. So it was so chosen that the meetings are not repeated at the same place. So the delegates who are coming for that particular engagement group or working group, they get a taste of the diversity of our country. The meetings are held at different locations, so they can taste a different cuisine, different textile, different culture, and something to take home about our ancient culture also.
Yes, sir. So, you've handled many critical ministries, curated mega events, but the challenges associated with this event, and how did you really go about it?
This was like a whole of government approach, as the Prime Minister has been saying, and so many ministries were involved. More than 15 ministries were involved in the engagement groups and the working groups. And the discussions in those groups meetings, they have gone into the final outcome of the declaration which happened yesterday, and everything finds the essence of that is there. The ministerials were held, and everything you find reflected there. Apart from that, the logistics, where the state governments are involved, the security agencies were involved, so many hotels, the private hospitality industry was involved, the culture.
Aligning with so many departments.
Yes, so everything, I think, not only it is an effort of the central government, but the state governments, they also wholeheartedly supported this. So it is the entire country which was involved in the G20. And I think that is why we are seeing the outcome today, that the entire world is appreciating the outcome.
Hosting an event of such a magnitude where literally the entire world has converged here in a national capital, New Delhi, and then beaming those live visuals across the globe, and especially the IBC. A bit more on that planning bit, sir. Extensive planning and putting everyone together, connecting dots.
The media center provided the facilities, but I think Doordarshan has done a great effort. So many people have been involved, and more than 78 cameras were set up just for the final summit. Again, 4K, the feeds were given to everybody, and then this is the outcome. But technically at the back also, the entire Doordarshan team has been working relentlessly for the past 2-3 months to put this show together. And I am sure, I can say that they have done the country proud.
State broadcaster rose to the occasion.
Yes, of course. The state broadcaster, which is Prasar Bharati, it rose to the occasion and provided the feed to the entire world.
All right, so before I move on to the outcome bit of it, would you like to also share your thoughts on the overall coverage of the event? We have international media here in footprint, huge numbers. Normally in summits you do get to see, but this was certainly different because invitee countries and other multilateral organizations.
This scale of media, where the media from all the world is represented, this kind of scale of media you don't get to see anywhere else. Maybe in our country you would have seen it in World Cup or sports competitions, but that again is a limited media which is devoted only to the sports and the sporting activities. But here it is a media which is looking at the very diverse range of topics, right from diplomacy to hospitality to culture, and in that the Prasar Bharati has played a major role in uplifting the image of the country.
Now talking about the Delhi Declaration and big firsts that have been associated with it. So finally, a quick thought on the way India has managed this 100% consensus and that too on a very first day?
The 100% consensus, of course, is again the vision of our Honorable Prime Minister and the respect which he commands in the Committee of Nations now. For the past 9 years, his efforts, and they are showing that his word, that is taken very seriously by whether it is the global north or the global south, and they take it very seriously. Now his sentence which he made 6-8 months back, that this is not the time of war, it finds a special reflection in this particular declaration.
Single line, para 14.
Yes.
Yes.
And then apart from that, digital public infrastructure on which our Prime Minister invested so much, and that is something which is unique to our country. Today only I was reading that 46% of the entire digital transactions in the entire world, they are happening in India. In August, more than 1 billion digital transactions happened. So that's that kind of scale which we have done, and it is so easy, seamless, instantaneous payments are happening. So that is something which we are showing to the world, and it has been displayed in all the engagement group meetings, all the working group meetings, and the entire world appreciates that, and you will find that there are several chapters, several paragraphs in the Declaration on the Digital Public Infrastructure.
One final question. India has also pitched, rather, Honorable Prime Minister has pitched this G20 presidency under India's presidency G20 as people-centric, human-centric approach and people's presidency. The whole concept or the vision or the ethos of Jan Bhagidari. Your thoughts?
Yes, of course. I mean, the people, in India, the Honorable Prime Minister, his entire vision is Jan Bhagidari, and he has taken it to the world so that the world also understands that the progress, the path of progress is only if the people are participating, and if we take the people along, only then the world can see progress like we are doing in India. India is one of the fastest growing democracies, and we would like the entire world to involve the people and take the same path.
This is pretty much in tandem with Prime Minister's vision of Vikas Bhi or Virasat Bhi. Heritage and development can go hand in hand. Thank you very much, Apur Chandra sir, for talking to us on DD India. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, moving on. Indian Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman met World Bank President Ajay Banga in New Delhi. Mr. Banga congratulated the minister for a constructive and successful presidency.
And during the meeting, World Bank's President Banga agreed to work closely with the Indian Finance Ministry to create a market structure from the corporate social responsibility demand side for maximizing social impact.
And Indian Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman met Asian Development Bank President Mr. Masasaku Asakawa, who is in India for the G20 Leaders Summit in New Delhi.
Asakawa is Asian Development Bank President, assured support to Prime Minister Modi's vision and transformative initiatives such as PM Gati Shakti, Gift City, Green Hydrogen Hub, Future Cities of India and more. This is through ADB's Country Partnership Strategy 2023 to 2027 for India.
US President Joe Biden thanked Prime Minister Modi for taking him to Rajghat in New Delhi. Mr. Biden wrote that the partnership between India and the United States is rooted in Mahatma Gandhi's principle of trusteeship that is shared between our countries and for our shared planet. Thank you, Prime Minister, for bringing us here today, unquote.
And the second and final day of the G20 summit in New Delhi also saw Prime Minister Modi, along with all the G20 leaders, including Joe Biden there, paying homage to Mahatma Gandhi at Rajghat. Rajghat is the place where India's father of the nation was consigned to flames. DD India's Amit Mukherjee reports.
As the G20 leaders arrived at Rajghat, each one of them received a shawl from Prime Minister Modi. The Indian Prime Minister greeted them individually. The world leaders laid wreaths to honor the memory of Mahatma Gandhi at Rajghat, where his mortal remains were cremated. They observed a brief silence as a mark of respect to the leader who led India to independence from the British Empire. Prime Minister Modi posted on X, former Twitter, and I quote, "At the iconic Rajghat, the G20 family paid homage to Mahatma Gandhi, the beacon of peace, service, compassion and non-violence. As diverse nations converge, Gandhiji's timeless ideals guide our collective vision for a harmonious, inclusive and prosperous global future." Unquote. A black marble platform marks the spot where the Gandhi's last rites were performed. Amit Mukherjee for DD India.
Enduring images. Those, again, credit to India's G20 presidency. Now, Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince and Prime Minister Mohammed bin Salman bin Abdulaziz Al Saud welcomed on Indian President Draupadi Murmu in New Delhi on Monday. The visiting dignitary will hold a bilateral meeting with Prime Minister Modi, and both leaders will also co-chair the first leaders' meeting of the Strategic Partnership Council.
They will review the progress made under the two ministerial committees of the Strategic Partnership Council as well. They'll also discuss all aspects of bilateral relations, including political, security, defense, trade and economic, cultural and people-to-people ties.
Both the leaders will also discuss the regional and international issues of mutual interest.
Right, Gautam, let's take a moment to welcome once again our three guests, Ambassador Mohan Kumar, Ambassador J.S. Mukul and Professor Harsh Pant on this special broadcast. Ambassadors and gentlemen, we are nearing the end of our time on this special broadcast. So one last question to all of you, starting with you, Ambassador Kumar. Looking back in hindsight, with the benefit of hindsight, what would you say the G20 summit has ticked all the right boxes for you?
Oh, I think the fact that India set itself up the goal for being the voice of the global South and for having fulfilled that particular objective in substantial measure, if not full measure, and I think for establishing and re-establishing the credibility of the G20 as an institution, as the premier forum for global economic cooperation, without a doubt, because frankly, the credibility of G20 was on the line before the Delhi summit. I thought India will be remembered for putting the G20 back on track.
And there will be an opportunity to build upon this success even in November with that proposal of the virtual meeting of the G20 leaders before India actually hands over the presidency to Brazil as well. Ambassador Mukul, do you think that is something that again will tell us how the success of this summit is being carried forward?
No, absolutely. As I said, that's also a first for India, that we are going to have this follow-up virtual summit in November at the end to mark the conclusion of our presidency. Also, the last visual that we saw of the meeting tomorrow, the bilateral meetings with the Saudi Crown Prince, I think is also very important. It also, I'm sure the connectivity project of India, Middle East and Europe will be further discussed there. And for me, the inclusion of African Union was also, I think, a historic first with regard to the G20. I think so, yes, all the boxes, as far as I'm concerned, were ticked, starting, of course, with the joint communique and going forward with the substantive issues involved therein.
Professor Pant, you get the last word. You think, the takeaways, according to your estimation, from the G20 summit, does it reinforce G20's position as a preeminent global economic grouping that can, take on the G7 and the BRICS, because it bridges the North-South and East-West divide as well?
Indeed, and I think, Ramesh, summits come and summits go. We don't even remember at times what happened, say, in Bali last year. But I think with this summit, India has ensured that it will be remembered. India has laid down a marker almost that, a number of achievements to its credit, and to the credit of the wider global multilateral order, where a lot of despondency had set in. I think India had revived faith once again, not only in G20, but in the process of the world coming together and trying to find solutions to global problems. I think countries, especially in the developing world, had given up on it. So I think we are seeing a revival of that. And I think along with that, a declaration almost that India is now willing and able to play the role of a leading power in global politics. We are willing to define global agenda in ways that conforms to our interests and that are in sync with the wider global interests. And I think underlining that with this idea that we work together for a joint future, I think those sentiments will echo long after the nitty-gritty of the declaration is forgotten. So I think India has done very well in terms of the big picture as well as in terms of the nuances that the Delhi Declaration brings to the fore.
Right. And do you think that this augurs well for the next big diplomatic event coming up on the global firmament as well, and that will be the COP28 in Dubai?
I think so. I think a lot of the discussions that major stakeholders have had here, they will take back to COP, where a lot of the climate change discussions, for example, would take place, and on all of these issues, where at one point there was a lot of concern whether consensus would be achieved, whether the issue of climate finance, technology transfer would ensure that the process is getting derailed. I think India has squarely brought the developed and the developing countries together on this as far as this declaration is concerned. And if you take these basic ideas from this declaration on to COP, I think COP negotiations, you will find a lot of material there on which to build and to revive once again the world's hope that something can be done about climate change.
Right. On that note, may I thank all our guests, Professor Harsh Pant, Ambassador Mohan Kumar, and Ambassador J.S. Mukul, for joining us on this special broadcast and sharing your thoughts with our viewers in India and abroad as well. Thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
Thanks a lot. Now, US President Joe Biden has received a warm welcome after he landed in Vietnam today.
He was accompanied by Communist Party General Secretary Nguyen Phu Trong in the ceremony organized in Vietnam's presidential palace.
US sees Vietnam as a key country in its strategy to secure global supply chains and to try and elevate its relations.
UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has raised concern over Chinese interference in the countries with its Chinese counterpart. Sunak met Chinese Premier Li Qiang during G20 summit in India and raised the issue of arrest of 2 alleged spies.
According to London, the police, the 2 spies arrested in March under Official Secrets Act and were later released on bail.
But with regard to my meeting with my Premier Li, what I said very specifically is that I raised a range of different concerns that we have in areas of disagreement, and in particular, my very strong concerns about any interference in our parliamentary democracy, which is obviously unacceptable. Well, as I said, we discussed a range of things, and I raised areas where there are disagreements, and this is just part of our strategy to protect ourselves, protect our values and our interests, to align our approach to China with that of our allies like America, Australia, Canada, Japan and others, but also to engage where it makes sense. And actually, I think the right thing to do is take the opportunity to engage, to raise concerns specifically, rather than just shouting from the sideline.
The death toll from a powerful earthquake that hit Morocco's Atlas Mountains region has risen to 2,012.
The quake is the strongest to hit the nation's center in more than a century.
Morocco is passing through a phase of 3 days of national mourning, following an earthquake that destroyed buildings and sent people fleeing from their homes. The flags flew at half-mast on all public buildings. The death toll continues to rise, amid hope fading with every passing moment to find any survivor. Rescue operations continued against all odds. UNESCO World Heritage buildings in Morocco's Marrakesh were gravely damaged in the earthquake. The world leaders have expressed their solidarity with the people of Morocco, many offering to extend their help.
The whole of the G20 has expressed its solidarity
We have mobilized technical and security teams to intervene once the Moroccan authorities decide that this may be useful.
As you can see, these aid supplies, whether from the government, such as food supplies, as well as aid from civil society organizations, what we can see now is aid and food supplies provided by the government to help people affected by the earthquake.
According to World Health Organization, more than 300,000 people have been affected by the disaster. The United Nations assured for the humanitarian aid and will assess reconstruction needs in the longer term. Aman Kumar Himanshu for DD India.
And that's all for this edition of DD India News Hour. Let us know your thoughts on the news of the day.
You can connect with us on Facebook, X, formerly Twitter, and Instagram.
We'll be back with more news as it breaks here on DD India. I am Ramesh Ramachandran.
And I'm Gautam Roy. And from all of us here in New Delhi, thanks for watching DD India News Hour.
Thank you.